All right, let's get started with our Bible class this morning. We are talking about gospel-centered marriage. The 6 gospel commitments that every couple needs to make. And this will be our second week on commitment number 2 that we looked at last week. We will make growth and change our daily agenda. And last week we were using the gardening illustration, right? Of that in the gardening process, you first need to take things out, right? Whether it's weeds or grass or whatever it is, if you're going to have a successful garden, there is work to be done. And I said this last week, that for your marriage to be healthy, you must have both destructive and constructive zeal. We primarily looked at the destructive part last week of that there are things that need to be destroyed, put to death, or taken out of your lives in order for your marriage to be healthy. We looked at the weeds of selfishness, busyness, inattention, self-righteousness, fear, and laziness last week as weeds that need to be removed from your life. But gardening is more than just pulling weeds, right? It's also planting the right kind of plants. And so to begin our discussion this morning, I want to ask the question, what are some of the biggest decisions that you can make in your life? Yeah, Wes?
One is getting married.
Getting married. Big decision. You should think about it a little bit, right, before you do it. Absolutely. What else?
Being baptized.
Getting baptized? For sure. I'm sure that for most of us in this room would top our lists, at least be in the top 3 or 5, I'm thinking, of big decisions we can make in our lives. What else?
Kids.
Whether or not to have kids, or when to have kids, or how you're going to parent said kids. Absolutely, right? Parenting, a huge responsibility, and you should probably think about it a little bit, right? Find a house. Probably, for most of us, the most expensive thing we will ever buy, right? And so, thinking about it, talking to, a financial expert or the bank or your realtor, right? Of like, you need to give some thought to that for sure. Anything else? We got getting married, having kids, getting baptized, buying a house, profession, job, right? And that's actually number 1. I looked it up of what people believe are the biggest decisions in their lives. And number 1 was starting a new job, or determining if you're going to start a new job or if you're not going to start a new job. It's all career-based, right? Of like, what job do you want? Are you going to accept that job offer? That's something that a lot of people get stressed out about or carry a lot of concern and worry in their lives. Number 2 was getting married. Number 3 was pursuing a degree, so just determining education-wise, like, are you going to go after a degree or are you going to go into a trade? Deciding, education-wise, what you're going to do. Number 4 was having children, and number 5 was buying a home. And so we pretty much covered all the bases there. And those are what we view as, these are like big milestones in our lives, right? The big decisions, people call them choice points, where, depending on what choice you make, kind of steers your life in one direction or another. But I would contend those choice points are not just the big decisions. These, top 5 that we talked about. It's the little decisions. And in the most mundane moments of daily life that almost go unnoticed, but are actually what shape and direct our lives. Because if you think about all of the little decisions that we make every day, or these little choice points that we can make throughout our day, that guides us to eventually make these bigger decisions. The quality and character of a marriage then isn't set in 2 or 3 grand moments of choice. I mean, you only get 3 or 4 big decisions that we can make in our entire lives. But the character of a marriage is formed in the thousands of little moments of saying yes to one thing and no to another. And using that garden illustration again, cleared ground doesn't stay cleared for long. Even if you don't intentionally plant things, if you go and till up a bunch of ground and prepare it and make sure all the weeds are out of it and you leave it alone, it might be clear for a day or 2 before something starts to grow. And typically those things are the weeds trying to get themselves back in there. It's not enough just to identify the weeds that need to go. You must also think about what God is calling you to put into their place. And so the section of Scripture that I want us to focus on this morning, we're going to devote the rest of our time to Galatians chapter 5. And typically, at least when I read through this section, I have a very self-interested view of what is being talked about in here. But this morning, when we read it, I'm going to read 13 through 26 here. I want us to view this with marriage in mind, okay? And then we're going to talk about it. So this is what it says, starting in Galatians 5, verse 13. It says, "For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things that you want to do. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Now the works of the flesh are evident: sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. I warn you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. And those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live by the Spirit, let us also keep in step with the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another." When you read through this section with marriage in mind, what part of this applies to marriage? Don't say all of it, because that's my answer. Well, what part of this kind of jumps out at you as like, oh, that's a really good thing to bring into your marriage, or to think about with marriage in mind? Yeah, Aaron?
I think right off the bat with verse 13, it says, through love serve one another. And then contrasting with verse 15, if you bite and devour one another, take care that you are not consumed by one another.
Yeah.
And differences that your marriage could take based on if you're serving or kind of an
Absolutely.
or whatever, going after your own desires.
Yeah. And in marriage, are you required to serve each other at times? Pretty much all the time, right? Treating the other with a higher regard
people, mostly television shows, I don't watch anybody argue, and I don't watch a lot of TV, but when they argue, and just those little killer things that couples can say to each other, it's just, you don't forget those.
That image, the words that Paul uses here, bite and devour each other. And you're right, I mean, for those of us who have experienced some really knockdown, drag-out fights in our marriages, you look back and you go, like, when putting those two words, bite and devouring each other, it's not a pretty picture that is painted. Casey, did you ever use that?
Just some.
Okay. Anything else? Stands out.
There's a little bit of a, I don't know, parallel. When it says, live by the Spirit, so you don't just go do whatever you want, right? So as soon as you enter into marriage, it's not about you. It's not what you're wanting to do. There's a higher purpose for your existence within that marriage.
Yeah.
Cannot really.
You're not just doing whatever you want, right? I mean, you can try that.
Try.
Uh,
It works out, but
Yes, yeah, it works out. But that's not a recipe, and we've talked about that in most of these classes. Selfishness continues to be brought up here in marriage as one of the chief problems. But where I want to start is in verse 15 with that phrase, bite and devour one another. You cannot escape the influence of what you do and say on the other person you live with. The fact that you are living with another human being, what you do and say is going to influence the other, right? You can't escape it. Even if you weren't married, even if you just live with a roommate, right? You're going to influence the other person. You can't help it because you're living your lives in such close proximity to each other that influence is going to happen. What we need to realize as husbands and wives is that God made you a person of influence in the life of your spouse. Viewing ourselves as one of the chief instruments that God is going to use in the life of your husband or wife is very important. You cannot escape the implication of Paul's words here. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. Notice what he says will be destroyed here. It's you. It's not that you bite and devour another person and then they are the ones who suffer. The picture that Paul's painting here is that everyone is going to suffer. And of course, Paul has more than just marriage in mind here. But what's true for the church is true in your marriage in this regard. You can rob your wife of her hope. And you can crush your husband's faith. You can damage one another's heart. You can cloud your spouse's view of God's goodness and grace, and you can tempt the other to believe that he or she is alone and without help. And as you devour these little chunks out of each other, you're actually hurting yourself. And this is where the words that we hear all the way back in the book of Genesis about being one flesh, that we come to understand what that's talking about. In Genesis 2, verse 24, it says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And that is talking about more than just a sexual relationship here, that they are one. And so in damaging the other, you are actually damaging yourself. And if you've lived in a state of this kind of disharmony in your marriage, you know that to be true.
that the more you damage the other person, the more you are actually damaging yourself. Because you are one flesh. Knowing that we are key influencers in our spouse's life, the question that we should be asking then is, how do I daily influence the way my spouse thinks about God? How do I influence the way that my spouse thinks about themselves? And how do I influence the way my spouse thinks about life in general? Because we have that type of influence going on, whether for evil, for bad, or on the flip side, for good. I want to back up to verse 13. It says, "For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." There is no bigger struggle for any of us, and there is nothing that complicates our marriages more than giving an opportunity for the flesh. Some versions talk about self-indulgence here. And here, the one thing we talked about this last week, another thing that we need to say no to, very similar to selfishness, is self-indulgence. What is an indulgence? Too much. Wes? Selfishness.
Self-indulgent.
Absolutely. Rod, you?
All right, so say something that makes you feel good, I guess.
It can be pleasurable, right? It means to give into a craving.
To go, like if something is drawing you in, it means to go where it is drawing you to go. If I go to a Chinese buffet, I don't have just one plate. I have many plates. There are many trips back to the buffet because there is a kind of a piece in my head that I'm thinking is like, well, I have to get my money's worth. Right? It's like, I have to. I paid that much. I'm going to make sure that they come out on the losing end of this agreement here. And so it's kind of a competition. But after 5, 6, 7 plates, the pleasure of eating that Chinese food doesn't become as pleasurable. Sure, I'm indulging myself, but again, I don't know if I'm coming out on the winning end after the fact. Healthy marriages are healthy because the people in those marriages have learned to recognize and to say no to selfish instincts, or the times where you want to give an opportunity for the flesh. Verses 16 and 17 says, "But I say to you, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things that you want to do." It tells us of another one of these things that we need to say no to, and that is the desires of the flesh. We're going to talk about the desires of the flesh in my sermon today, so I'm not going to talk about it very much, but know this, that those desires of the flesh are opposed to the work of the Spirit in your life. And by the way of just how it works, if it is opposed to the work of the Spirit in your life, guess who else it's opposed to the work of the Spirit of? In your spouse's life, in your marriage life together. Verses 19 through 21. Here we get the list of these desires of the flesh, or the works of the flesh. It says they are evident: sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. I warn you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. It's quite a list. And it's not a fun list to read off. But when you think of all the damage that can be done in a marriage, of all the things that can go wrong, or the pitfalls that many couples fall into, and you look at this list, the list is stunningly accurate. They depict not just the big life-changing moments, but the daily irritations, the daily insults that we can give to each other. I mean, think about it. Has your marriage ever been free from discord? Have you ever lived without jealousy? Have you ever been free of instances of rage? Has selfish ambition ever gotten in the way of your marriage? Have you ever had dissension in your marriage? Has an otherwise nice day ever been kidnapped by envy? And what Paul writes next is also impactful to our marriages. We get the flip side, the nice list here. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. You see, planting seeds is really what Paul is calling us to do here. We are called to intentionally plant good seeds of a healthy relationship into the soil of our marriages. And he gives us the seeds. And this will take understanding and commitment and discipline and perseverance in order to do this. It doesn't just happen by itself. But when both husband and wife are planting these seeds, your marriage does not become perfect, but it does become a place where real unity, understanding, and love have room to live and breathe and grow. So let's go through this list. We're not going to touch every one of these, but the ones that I think we need to talk about, we will. Love. What does the commitment to serve your spouse in love look like? Well, it looks like getting up in the morning and committing to search for concrete ways to love your husband or your wife. Asking questions like, where does he tend to be discouraged or overwhelmed, and how can I help? What are the daily tasks which she could use some assistance with? In what special way can you communicate your affection? More than just words scribbled on a note. Maybe love gets communicated by fixing something that is broken in the house, or maybe it's best communicated by your willingness to take over a duty that usually falls to the other. When you think about love, I mean, there's so many different directions that we can go, and things that we could talk about that are all about love, and they would all have merit, and they would all be distinct to your own relationship. But this is the question I want you to ask yourself with this. Would you call your spouse a loving person? Do they pay attention? Do they are they searching for the concrete ways? Are you loving towards your spouse? The next one is joy. Serving each other in love means being committed to joy. What does this look like in marriage, though? How can you be committed to joy in your marriage? Love's the easy one, right? Joy, that's kind of a different way of thinking. Rob?
Trying to be upbeat.
Trying to be upbeat? What if that annoys your wife, though?
That's our fault.
What if she says, you're too upbeat? Can we just bring it down a little bit? It's not that great. Casey.
When little things that show your love bring you joy,
So that would be like communicating your joy to the other person. Of like, that was nice. Thank you. And not said as condescending as I made that sound. Thank you.
For that.
Anything else? How can we be committed to joy? How do we plant the seed of joy into the soil of our marriages? Maybe it's looking for reasons to be thankful. I think that there are probably things in your life that you wish weren't there. For all of us, whether that is represented by a person, a coworker, maybe it's a situation, maybe it's financial. There are plenty of things in our lives that look to steal our joy from us. But by helping
your spouse to be thankful, counting your blessings, you can be committed to joy. Maybe it means being better at counting your blessings than you are at calculating your complaints, or communicating your appreciation for what your husband or wife does. It's about daily thanking God for your marriage, even though it's less than perfect. You can be committed to that. Joy means looking for the good in the other person and encouraging it when you find it. Positive and negative reinforcement. I think as human beings, we typically are more weighted towards negative reinforcement. It comes more easy to us. Positive reinforcement is a skill that needs to be practiced. And typically we talk about that with our kids, right? Of like positive and negative reinforcement, but you need to use that with your spouse as well. To be able to communicate, hey, I appreciate what you do. I appreciate what you do for our family, and looking for the good in the other person and encouraging it when you find it. Margaret, what were you going to say?
Sometimes it's good to just be silly and have jokes and just, make it a happy time.
Absolutely. Not everything needs to be doom and gloom all the time, or I would say, I would hope rarely.
That way, he always made me feel good. Jokes and his good disposition.
Absolutely. And the stories that I've heard about your husband, Margaret, I would imagine that to be true. Being able to have fun together. Not be so serious. We have to be serious in so many different areas of our life. Not to say that there's not areas in our marriage that we need to take seriously, but also giving time to enjoy each other and laugh and make jokes, I think is so important, Margaret. Scott?
I have found that joy emerges in my life when I'm being, or when I'm working on these things, when sin is not, a concern. When I'm having victory, I feel joyful more often than not.
Absolutely, and I think that can also be a matter of perspective. But the thing about perspective is that perspective can be encouraged by your spouse. And so you can kind of stay in that joy cycle, right, of victory and joy. Even though that, defeats and challenges are going to come your way, if you have that right perspective, you can stay with that. Peace is the next one.
And I think, I don't know. I think all of these have their place, but I think peace is probably one of the easier ones to see of how would this be beneficial to your marriage? Well, there is so much conflict in our lives. Almost every day we are angry or impatient, irritated, resentful, or disappointed with someone or something in our lives. And selfishness that we struggle so mightily against makes it easier to make war than it is to make peace. Will we be quick and willing to forgive our spouses? Will we find unity more important than winning? Will we not allow ourselves to resurrect offenses that have already been forgiven? The question you ask yourself is your spouse a peacemaker? Am I a peacemaker? Is this a seed that needs to be sown more readily into the soil of our marriage? Kindness. I think a lot of these things we could all kind of throw into the basket of kindness and love, but maybe the best way to think about this is thinking back to the time when you were courting your spouse, when you were dating, when you were, both interested in each other and batting your eyes at each other longingly. Being kind and doing what is good are the commitments of everyone in courtship, because you're trying your best to try to win the other person, right? So being kind and doing what is good are the commitments for everyone in a courtship. At least it should be. If there's some other motive in there, it's probably an unhealthy relationship. But when was the last time you treated the other like you did when you were dating? Alicia and I, we started dating in the age before cell phones. And so if we wanted to send notes to each other, it wasn't through text. We actually had to write it on pieces of paper. And I know I'm saying this to a room full of people that were like, duh, right? But there's a whole generation in that other room that knows nothing about this, of writing a note on a piece of paper, and then you'd fold it into a little paper football, right? And then we would either pass it to each other in the hallway, or slip it into each other's lockers, or if we're in the same class, we'd just throw it at each other. And we still, Alicia, we still have some of those, don't we? Buried somewhere deep, deep, far away. But I remember, might have been, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, we got some of them out and reread them. Talk about cringe-worthy. But I was in love, and it was saying just really stupid things. But it was just the wanting to communicate with this girl that wanted to communicate with me. It was just it was intoxicating, right? But as things go, I want to say every marriage, things just kind of lose their luster after a while. And you forget about those little things. Think about something that you did back when you were courting or dating your spouse. What about resurrecting one of those things? If at the very least you might get a laugh out of it, right, Margaret? Right? Well, that's kindness. Faithfulness, of course, right? Sowing seeds of faithfulness into your marriage. What are the vows that you made on your wedding day? I'm guessing that it had something to do with putting the other's needs above your own. It's about being committed to your spouse in every way possible, and it starts with your mind, your thoughts and your desires. Do you allow yourself to fantasize about leaving your marriage? Do you ever look at or think about another person in ways that you shouldn't? Are you still loving your spouse as fervently as you did that day when you made those vows? Are there other things that have gotten in the way? Or would your spouse say that you have been faithful in the way that you promised? Faithfulness. How important is that in a marriage? Or gentleness. Scott, you go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that faithfulness works along with the amount of effort you put into your relationship. You build that over the years. You build that relationship and good memories eventually get to the point where I'm gonna be faithful because, you know, look at all that we put into this. I don't wanna leave this behind. I don't wanna have a negative effect on it.
It's built brick by brick, memory after memory, event, day after day, absolutely.
Yes, the scripture says, hold fast to one another.
Hold fast.
Hold fast. And that takes work
Yeah.
sometimes.
And what a way of thinking of that word faithfulness.
Holding fast to each other. Absolutely.
Yeah, a lot of people know this. You know, me and Sheila got married after 10 days. Never even did our first date till after we were married. And I look back on it now, and love at first sight, yeah, I believe it exists. But I'm looking back on, like at the beginning when we started this lesson, we were married maybe 18 months and had Crystal, and I got slammed with the remote to where I had to leave her for a year. And, you know, here I was, young, married, we really were still getting to know each other, to be honest with you, we really were. And when I went on this remote to Sicily, the first 89 days, we were working security and didn't get one day off. We worked every single day. And then they finally said, hey, we're gonna let you go downtown and go to the Club Med. Now, I don't know if anybody ever heard of the Club Med, but it's a big European organization with nicest beaches, nicest whatever. We got to go for free. Well, we got on in their shops, and you know, so it was pretty neat to be able to actually go live for a day. And when we got there, I'm not gonna explain all the things that I saw or whatever, but I knew that was a place I never could go back to, ever. Because I knew it was a place that would tempt me beyond temptation. You know what I'm saying? So I think that's, in a marriage, there's temptations that are gonna be out there. You're gonna be tempted, and you gotta fight against it. And all of these this is where all of these come in, sort of comes self-control, faithfulness, goodness, kindness. I mean, just all this here. Had I gone through and went back there every week, just the weakness of the flesh, I honestly believe I may not have been faithful to my wife. It's that simple. No matter how much I loved her, you know, no matter how much I didn't like that I did. But to prove it, we went over, there were 86 people that went over there married out of 112, and we all left together. And only 8 of us went home married. That's fact.
Yeah.
So see, but, and I guarantee you, not because I knew everybody, I just took a part-time job where I worked every day. When I wasn't working, I was in a part-time job. Most of them people, you know, ended up going to the Club Med every single weekend. Every single weekend.
Wow.
So it did not surprise me that ended up the way it was. You know what I'm saying? So I just wanted to go back to the beginning where we were talking about, you know, the lust of the flesh and, you know, but anyway.
Absolutely.
It all ties together, right? And faithfulness is something that needs to be protected and guarded, putting boundaries on yourself in order to do exactly that. Absolutely. When we come to gentleness, it means that something doesn't get damaged in the process of being handled, right? That's what gentleness means. But times in our disappointment and hurt, our responses like gentleness are deepening the difficulty with which we are already struggling. Gentleness should not be confused with weakness. Gentleness is a quiet confidence in the power of God to change what needs to be changed. Are we gentle with our spouses? And this is not just a husband to wife seed that needs to be planted. It's also the vice versa. Self-control. A good marriage is always the result of saying no, not necessarily to the other person, but saying no to yourself. Right? It's self-control, not other control. Is there a more needed character quality in a marriage than self-control? I don't think so. It's the constant willingness to critique your thoughts, edit your words, and constrain your behavior out of love for your spouse. And Alicia and I were just talking about this, that during our dating days, as euphoric as they were also quite volatile. And what led me into ministry, at least one of the gifts that I believe God has given me, is that I am a man of many words. And I've always been a talker. God gave me the gift of gab. And I have, at times in our past, used that ability that God has given me to fashion words and phrases to do a lot of harm. And we were talking about that the other day of just how that has changed in our relationship, and that I realized that one of the best things that I can do in our marriage is sometimes to just keep my mouth shut because of the damage. The potential damage that could be done is not worth it for me to win or to get my way. Planting seeds, these kind of seeds, is difficult. I said that before we started into this list. It is a very, very difficult thing to do, because we are stressed, we are overworked, we are overplanned, there's so much stuff going on, and things continue to get busier and busier and busier and faster and faster and faster. Planting good seeds, these type of good seeds, I would encourage you in this way, in that it's going to require help. If you're going to pull the deeply rooted weeds of a selfish heart and plant new seeds of self-sacrificing love, you will need help. You see, very few are naturally good at gardening and horticulture. So what do? They leverage many books and videos and TikToks into a finished product that they can be proud of. And I would say that even fewer are those who are naturally good at cultivating a healthy marriage. You need to leverage the wisdom and experience of a trusted mentor or mentoring couple if you're going to do it well. Back in verse 16 it says, "But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh." It says, walk by the Spirit. And where we might stand before the judgment seat individually, in this life we walk together. And so find yourself a mentor or a mentoring couple, whether that is personally or through an avenue of a book or going to a seminar. Find something that can help you along the way, because this is not a natural thing to do. Commitment number 2. We will make growth and change our daily agenda. It's a commitment we need to make in our marriages if we want them to thrive. So your homework this week, if you are so inclined to do so, is to look through the fruit of the Spirit. Look back through that list. Recall some of the things that we discussed and talked about today with that list, and ask the question, are they in your marriage? Are you sowing these kind of seeds into your marriage? And if not, why not? And how can we, or how can you be better at it? Let's say our closing prayer, and then we'll be dismissed from our class this morning. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much again for today and this time that we can look into your word. God, thank you for our marriages. Thank you for our spouses and what they bring into our lives. God, help us to think of ourselves here and the kind of spouse that we are being and representing in our marriage. Is there something that we can do better? Is there something that we have lost sight of and got distracted by? God, help us to know these. Help us to please bring them to our attention, and help us to change in ways that are in accordance with your word. God, please be with us now. Help us to worship you during our worship service and speak and sing these words from a true heart in worship to you. We love you so very much. It's in your Son's name that I pray. Amen.